I grew up in the San Francisco Bay Area in the turbulent 1960s and early 70s. And civil rights and peace movements were going on, like the March on Selma that took place 50 years ago this weekend. And that was on a large scale, but things were going on a smaller scale as well. Like my mom did things. She joined the NAACP and sent care packages to the poor in the Deep South, and she even wrote letters to the editor of the San Jose Mercury News. I don't, however, recall my parents going to the public protests that seemed to saturate that part of our country, and I was too young to go on my own. But like most adolescents of that time and that place, I yearned to take on what we call the man, to be involved. I wanted to be an active part of what I understood to be unrest aimed at transforming the world. And I know it's not everybody's thing, but at the time, as a kid, I would love to have participated in the public protests and nonviolent unrest. And not having an adult to drag me to the happenings, I was left on my own devices, and I became involved in environmental efforts, and I tutored younger children. I even rode around San Jose with bumper stickers upright on my bike rack for all to see. And of course, I also wore peace and ecology buttons, and I argued, and I debated with others on war and civil rights issues like I think a lot of folks, including my mom, were doing. When I became a college freshman in mid-1970s, the era of unrest was ending but lingering still. And in college, I finally felt empowered to do a bit more. I worked on weekends entertaining children at health stations and migrant farm worker camps, and I did volunteer work tutoring children with reading concerns, and I still rode that bike everywhere with a bumper sticker. But my biggest memory from my freshman year have to do with some unrest, a public protest that I staged. And you may disagree with me, many people have, but as a feminist, I felt that the selection of a homecoming beauty queen at my college was a very sexist tradition that needed to be challenged. So I checked the rules, and I discovered that no one had thought to limit contestants to women. And so I caused a ruckus by applying and running for homecoming queen of San Jose City College. Oh, would you have been there? My simple point was that if we wanted homecoming representatives from our college, they should not be selected based on a sexist beauty contest, which I was protesting as I supported gender equality. And there's two things I remember most about that unrest. First is the hostility and the hate that my protest engendered. As I sat in the room with the other contestants, I endured the ugliest, meanest taunts and anger I have ever encountered. I prepared myself with feminist points to make in front of the judges, but I was not ready for the co-contestants scowling at me. And the second thing I remember is that in the weeks leading up to the contest, I met the most beautiful person that I've ever encountered, Nancy. And she not only knew from the newspaper I was running for homecoming queen, but she became a dear friend and supporter at the time, which months later thankfully led to our dating and, well, you know the rest of the story. In the interest of full disclosure, despite my brilliant performance in front of the judges and obvious good looks, I did not win and become the 1976 homecoming queen of San Jose City College. Now, truthfully, I didn't expect to win. I did it as a symbolic protest. I ran even though some folks found it disturbing that I did. It wasn't a Selma large-size protest, but I did it. And here's the thing that I'm hoping you'll remember. Whether you agree with my ideals or not, I still caused a little unrest with the point eventually being heard on a pretty big campus, even though my protest occurred in a small part of the college in front of a panel of just a few judges. And parenthetically, of course, I get the best consolation prize ever, a lifelong partner and pal in love named Nancy. And I mentioned the small Unrest I stage because a lot of us listen to the lectionary lesson from John about Jesus disrupting the temple and don't think of it as stage, but as Jesus lashing out in a rather disturbing fashion. The turn the other cheek, love your neighbor, love your enemy, and forgive everyone. Jesus doesn't seem to be in the lesson. Non-violence and love and peace seem to have been set aside in Jesus' actions. And we tend to hear Jesus is getting so upset and downright angry in the temple, a sacred space, that he loses his temper and rages about thrashing the temple and threatening the well-being of animals and humans. That's what the story in today's reading and the painted images and even the reenactments in drama and movies ever since suggest happened. But this morning, I want to suggest that's not very likely what happened. What's likely is that Jesus staged a bit of unrest, a protest in the temple, and it was heard and it was remembered, but it was not recorded in writings until more than a generation later. And by then, the story had layers of embellishment added and spins put on it. Something happened in the temple, a protest. But what was it? What was Jesus up to? Last year on Palm Sunday, we discussed how Jesus rode in on a humble donkey as a protest. Pilate on that day rode into Jerusalem as a military leader on a horse in a parade of soldiers representing Rome's power sent in to quell unrest with violence or the threat of it. Rome used violence to crush unrest, to bring about peace, the Pax Roma. And on the other side of town, Jesus rode into Jerusalem in a likely small parade of palm-bearing peasants representing God's power, on a humble donkey as a spiritual leader among ordinary people, causing unrest with non-violent love, to bring about justice and ultimately real peace. Shalom. Palm Sunday was street theater, like to use a 60s and 70s concept. Earthly power looking like earthly power always does. Violent clashes with heavenly power looking like it always does, with the God of Jesus at the helm. Non-violent. Heavenly empire uses non-violent unrest to get peace. And the earthly empire violently crushes unrest to get peace. We can hear the clash. Jesus on a donkey with a message of unrest to obtain humble peace wins the clash. God can be dramatically seen with him in the throngs, gleaming weapons and breastplates, pageantry and violent might to stop unrest. Do not give the message of love. The message of love is found on the guy on the donkey who represents God creating unrest with the way things are to get to peace. The way things ought to be. Shalom. Jesus' Palm Sunday Street Theater demonstration was a brilliant protest portraying what cosmic power looks like. No shiny armor and blades needed. Just seeking justice, loving kindness, and walking humbly with God every time. That was the Palm Sunday protest. It can be heard to be about symbolically standing up to earthly empire's army sent to quell unrest during Passover. The temple protest, where Jesus creates more unrest, is thought to have occurred after that, probably the next day, Monday, during what we now call Holy Week. Pilate's entry into Rome with military might that Sunday was to police the Passover week as pilgrims arrived and the threat of protest, unrest increased. And on Monday, Jesus defied that might, creating a bit of unrest in the Roman-controlled temple. Now, Had Jesus literally done what we picture, and John suggests in the lectionary reading that Dick read, Pilate's army garrison that literally overlooked the temple would have swooped in on Jesus and arrested him then, if not killed him then on the spot, violently wielding a multi-thonged whip while chasing all the merchants and money changers and animals out of the temple, and scattering coins and overturning tables would have surely caused the police and military to immediately and unmercifully pounce on Jesus. The scale of his reported action in the temple, as John tells it, would have brought in the centurions, maybe even quicker than such behavior in a mall would bring in squads of police today. That Jesus was not arrested at the temple evidences that his actions were, as Marcus Borg put it, sufficiently limited so as not to incite intervention. It was not intended to be efficacious, but was a symbolic act. In other words, it is not likely that Jesus went into the temple and lost it one day, having a fit of violence against the buyers and the sellers, throwing all the tables over and violently chasing everybody out with a whip. In fact, the physical layout of the temple belies that this could have occurred. The temple area covered 35 acres. It was big enough to fit 34 football fields. During Passover, it was very busy with thousands of people. So this wasn't like chasing a few people out of a store downtown. It would have been more like chasing out multitudes at a big city mall the weekend before Christmas. And all of this information evidences that it was physically impossible for Jesus to run around with a whip, literally doing all the stuff John reports that he did in our lesson today. And John's violent Jesus, of course, doesn't comport with the actions of the forgiving, loving Jesus, who in the rest of the gospel teaches and urges love and justice and peace and acts accordingly. Now, Jesus could certainly have spoken critically or harshly, even turned tables over and let animals loose in civil disobedience to symbolically disrupt the temple, but nowhere else in the gospel stories does Jesus wield weapons or hit people or animals. And he preaches the opposite. So John's report, or at least how we hear it, with an angry, violent Jesus, doesn't jibe with the physical reality nor with what we know about Jesus. And all four Gospels, however, do report that Jesus did something in the temple, some sort of protest that was remembered. Mark, the earliest Gospel, the one closest to Jesus' time, it's still a generation later, records this somewhat less violent version of the story. Jesus entered the temple and began to drive out those who were selling and those who were buying in the temple. And he overturned the tables of the money changers and the seats of those who sold doves, and he would not allow anyone to carry anything through the temple. He was teaching and saying, "Is it not written, my house shall be called a house of prayer for all the nations, but you have made it a den of robbers." And when the chief priests and the scribes heard it, they kept looking for a way to kill him, for they were afraid of him, because the whole crowd was spellbound by his teaching. And when evening came, Jesus and his disciples went out of the city. Well, that story in Mark has some impossible events going on too, like not allowing anyone to carry anything through the temple. Literally, that could not be accurate. And again, it's hard to picture a non-violent, loving, forgiving Jesus driving out people in the sense of threatening them, especially since we're told in that Mark reading that the whole crowd was spellbound, not angry with his teachings. And if he'd done any of that stuff, even as Mark records it, again, surely the Roman guard would have quickly swooped in and stamped his effort out, but they didn't. Jesus left the temple, strongly suggesting the gospel accounts exaggerate Jesus' actions. But Jesus did enter the temple, and he did do some sort of protest there. And that protest would have been a direct challenge to Rome's way of doing things. Jesus was challenging Rome's control and its quelling of unrest. And he was challenging the temple leadership and the worshipers, letting themselves be quelled. That challenge, perhaps coupled with his Palm Sunday protests and a reputation as one criticizing Roman authority and Roman appointed authority, led to Jesus' arrest and his trial, his conviction, and his execution. You see, the temple protest may very well have been the last straw. All of this, though, still begs the question, what was Jesus protesting? Going to the earliest version of the story of Mark, we can hear that he's remembered as protesting the temple as having been made a den of robbers. And that's actually a quote from Jeremiah 7. The word robbers better understood as someone who commits any form of resistance to establish control. That's what the word translated as robber means. In Jeremiah 7, that Old Testament verse was referring to temple leaders and worshipers who resisted God's control, making their temple a den, as in a lair, a hideaway from doing God's work in the world. You see, the temple at times was seen by prophets as behaving, well, like a lot of churches in history behave. It's a holy place to go and be led to act and say pious things, but leave and go out in the world to commit, or allowed to be committed, unholy acts like oppression of outcasts and the poor. They, in other words, are not being the places that they should be, by causing holy unrest out in the world to get oppression ended, to get God's work done. The den of robbers saying is not about the temple vendors being robbers. The merchants and the coin exchanges were not the issue. The issue was the temple being used as a hideaway where God's established control was resisted. Instead of God's holy unrest being carried out, Rome's quelling of that was allowed to occur. It was Rome in Jesus' place and time that spearheaded the resistance to God by controlling the temple, allowing it to only do what Rome wanted. Jeremiah 7, and the use of it in the Synoptic Gospels by Jesus can be heard to be akin to the Micah 6 text that's on the wall. That text is surrounded in the Bible by the prophet's criticism of worshiping things in the temple, not being followed by seeking justice and loving kindness and religious, humble walking out in the world. Oppression of outcasts went on unchecked. And in Jesus' day, Rome was not only oppressing the outcasts, but not allowing the temple to stop it. And what Rome sought was the utter domination of Palestine and its inhabitants. And Rome used the temple as best it could to that end. So much so that Jesus' challenge of that temple was a challenge of Rome. And Rome did not take kindly to challenges. Micah and Jeremiah and actually all the prophets and Jesus were trying to stir people up to have an unrest against the way things were. The status quo was being shaken. And they promoted unrest even as the earthly powers tried to stop it. And sometimes they protested the earthly powers outside the temple. And sometimes they protested the earthly powers inside it. It's a part of the temple. John the Baptist actually did both. He called people into the Jordan River as a symbolic reconquering of the promised land from the Romans. And he's also out there in the water offering repentance and forgiveness, something the Roman-controlled temple alone was supposed to do. And Jesus may have been following John the Baptist's blueprint, protesting both Rome and the temple. And he brought the protest from the countryside into the city, into Jerusalem. On Sunday of Holy Week, Palm Sunday, Jesus can be heard as protesting an earthly empire's army sent to quell unrest during Passover. And on Monday of Holy Week, Jesus can be heard as protesting the quelling of that unrest by the earthly empire. Through Jesus, the empire of God clashed with the Roman Empire, that empire of man. Rome took a violent swipe at Jesus, killing him. But God non-violently swiped back with long-lived resurrection. God joined in on the protest of Rome's violence and quelling, stopping of justice and kindness. One of the most important lessons in the Gospels is that Rome couldn't stop God's unrest with injustice. Jesus created that unrest in the way that he taught and that he lived and that he protested. And our job today as Christians is to keep that unrest going so that one day earthly empire's ways rule no more, so that God wins, so that love wins, so that Jesus wins, so that we all win. You'll see, holy unrest must not be quelled. Indeed, it ultimately cannot be stopped. That's the good news. Amen.